Good morning. My name is Matt Weidinger. I'm the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI almost 2 years ago, I worked for 28 years on Capitol Hill, including serving 15 years as the staff director of the U.S. House Ways and Means Subcommittee on Unemployment and Major Welfare Benefit Programs. It's my privilege to welcome everyone to today's AEI event titled Empowering American Workers, a discussion with Reps. Andy Barr and Mike Johnson. Representatives Johnson and Barr are important leaders on these issues in the U.S. House of Representatives, and we're honored to have them joining us today. Mike Johnson is a Republican who has represented Louisiana's 4th congressional district since late 2016. Despite his relatively recent arrival in Washington, D.C., Representative Johnson was selected by his colleagues at the beginning of the current Congress to serve as the chairman of the Republican Study Committee, which is the largest group of conservative legislators in the House. Andy Barr is a Republican who's represented Kentucky's 6th congressional district since 2013. He also currently serves as the chairman of the RSC American Worker Task Force. That task force released a report last week ambitiously titled Reclaiming the American Dream: Proposals to Empower the Workers of Today and Tomorrow. The report includes no fewer than 118 distinct proposals suggesting specific education, labor, and welfare policy reforms. I was interested to see one proposal calling for ending the housing first policy, which is something that AEI President Robert Doar and I learned about firsthand when we joined a member of Chairman Barr's staff in a visit to a women's shelter in Frankfort, Kentucky last October. Before we get started, I just want to say a few words about how today's event will proceed. In a minute, I'll join Chairman Johnson and hopefully Chairman Barr, if he joins us shortly, in a discussion about empowering workers and the report that they and their colleagues assembled. I will also pose some questions offered by our audience. So if viewers have a question for our guests, please send it by email to jillian.wheeler@aei.org. That's JILLIAN.WHEELER@AEI.org, or on Twitter at the hashtag AEI Empower Workers. And your question may be among those that are asked. Then at 11:15, our guests will take their leave and we'll have a panel discussion with AEI scholars that will be moderated by Scott Winship, who is AEI's new director of poverty studies. Earlier this month, Scott joined AEI from his most recent post as the executive director of the Joint Economic Committee in Congress. Prior to his tour of duty on Capitol Hill, Dr. Winship worked for several research institutions, including the Manhattan Institute, the Brookings Institution, and the Pew Charitable Trust. At AEI, Scott will continue his work on social mobility and the causes and consequences of poverty in America. Also joining us on the panel that Scott will moderate will be AEI's Director of Domestic Policy Studies, Ryan Streeter, Resident Fellow Brent Orell, and Rowe Scholar Angela Rashidi. We will drill down further on today's topic and also consider questions again from the audience. So once again, if you have questions for our second panel, you can submit a question by email to jillian.wheeler@aei.org, JILLIAN.WHEELER@AEI.org, or on Twitter at hashtag AEI Empower Workers. And with all that, we'll wrap up by noon Eastern. So with that, let me welcome for now Chairman Johnson, and I'll welcome Chairman Barr when he's able to join us. First, congratulations on an impressive piece of work. Having worked for a long time on Capitol Hill and participated in task forces like this, I know it's a big lift for both the members of the task force, the chairman of the committee, and also the staff who usually are in the background on these things and not given enough love about the hard work that went into this. So tell us about RSC, especially the task force, the other task forces that you have. Why was the task force created? How did it vet policies that made it into the report? And what ultimately do you hope to accomplish with the report?
Yeah, Matt, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you for participating. I'm a big fan of AEI. And I was thinking this morning, preparing for this, that it was almost exactly 2 years ago, sat down with Arthur Brooks at another AEI event when we used to be able to gather together live, when Mark Walker, my predecessor at RSC, was handing the baton over to me to take over as the new chairman. And as many of you all know, Matt, you've done great work on the Hill all these years. And many of you that have been around Capitol Hill know the great history of the Republican Study Committee. It's the largest caucus of conservatives and Republicans in Congress. We have currently 148 members in this Congress. All the self-identified conservatives are a part of the group. And it was founded back in the early 70s to be what they called, Ed Follner was one of the founding executive directors. He said it was the intellectual arsenal of conservatism in the House. And we've taken that charge seriously. When I ran for chair, I was recruited by colleagues to do it. I said, look, I'm not the oldest, I'm not the most senior guy here, I'm not the brightest guy here. I don't claim to be any of those, but I'll be a workhorse. And what I believe in is our foundational principles. And I told Arthur on the stage at that event 2 years ago that I proposed to my colleagues that we break it down to 7 core principles of conservatism, because I felt at the time in 2018 that in some ways we were losing our way as a party and as conservatives. And I boiled it down to 7 key ideas. It's limited government, individual freedom, the rule of law, peace through strength, fiscal responsibility, free markets, and human dignity. And the interesting thing about the American Worker Task Force, the one that produced this report we're talking about today, is it incorporates so many of those ideas all in one. What we did when I came in as chairman is RSC at the time had as many as 24 different task forces within the caucus. And we eliminated a lot of those that weren't doing anything. For example, we had a Second Amendment task force in which all 148 members were listed as a part of the group, and they never met or did anything. So we sort of eliminated all that, and we boiled it down to 5 working task force groups. And the objective was to produce real substantive policy reports just like this, because we looked at the reality of the fact that we were in the minority for 2 years, but rather than waste time and wander in the wilderness, I proposed that it could be our most productive time if we got to work really down into the details of these great challenges that face the country. And so we did a report. Our budget and spending task force produced their budget, still the only long-term budget that exists on Capitol Hill today. In this Congress. We have the National Security Foreign Affairs Task Force that produced a fantastic report. We have a task force called GEAR, the Government Efficiency, Accountability, and Reform Task Force, which many of y'all have seen. We produced a big report with over 100 proposals to streamline government and make it work more efficient for people. We've done each of these areas. Healthcare task force, we produced a plan last October that still is the only comprehensive conservative healthcare plan on the Hill, came out to great acclaim. And then now we finally released the last of these, the American Worker Task Force. And as I mentioned, this one's been highly anticipated because it incorporates so many of our core principles, and it addresses key needs in the government and in the country. And so we boiled this down to 3 primary objectives. There's a lot that could fall under this large, all-encompassing umbrella of policy. But we boiled it down very simply to refine our education system, to better equip the American worker, to refocus our labor policy to unleash the American worker, and reimagine welfare to empower individuals and families. We feel like if we can really move forward meaningful reforms in each of those areas, that we can do well by the most American people. And that's the objective here. That's what we're after. That's what we're trying to accomplish. We have over 100 concrete policy proposals in this publication. And the beauty of this is, and the purpose behind all these reports, Matt, is that as we come out with these, some of these ideas are existing pieces of legislation. Some are being reduced to legislative text now, and some have yet to be done. But the idea was we compiled all the task force reports, including this one, into one kind of large, all-encompassing publication, and we call it the Conservative Playbook for a Republican-led Congress. And we actually published that a day after this task force report came out. And so all of the members, all Republican members in Congress, whether RFC members or not, were given a hard copy of that about 400-page volume now. And I sat down with Kevin McCarthy yesterday, our Republican leader. I said, Kevin, by way of reminder, this is for use of the whole conference. This is orthodox conservative stuff. There's no fringe stuff here. This follows in accordance with all of our core policies, and everybody in the conference can use it. And I hope and trust that if we're given the ball again, the majority, which I think we can be this fall, to begin the next Congress, that we can use these ideas and run with it. And that's the plan.
All right, great. Thank you for that summary. So the title of this specific report is Reclaiming the American Dream. So that's a really ambitious task. Speak just a minute about what the report and what you think the American dream is. Why does it need reclaiming? And in general, how would the proposals in the report reclaim it?
It's a great question. And it is an ambitious title and an ambitious goal that we have, but it's critically important because all of us sense and feel that the American dream, however it's defined by individuals, is a concept that has been pulled further away from us. In recent decades, the American dream has been pulled further beyond the grasp of more and more people. In the period in which we all grew up, I'm a child of the 80s. I'm a Reagan kid, right? And I'm a fireman's son and first college graduate in my family. I mean, the American dream to me is what they taught us. They said, if you are willing to work hard and play by the rules and sacrifice, then you can make a better life. The promise of America is that you can go to the next rung on the ladder, so to speak. The opportunity for economic mobility for more and more Americans is part of the American dream. And everybody may define it individually a little bit different, but the idea is that it's grounded in liberty and opportunity. And what we found and what frustrates us, and I know many of you, is that also in recent decades, the reason that the dream has been pulled further beyond the grasp of more people is that the government, in so many cases, has gotten in the way. Sometimes well-intended government policy turns out to become hurdles for people. It limits opportunity and it limits freedom. And so the general kind of driving force behind this report and all the work that this task force has done is to get us back to those things, to enhance liberty, to enhance opportunity, and therefore to restore, as we say, the American dream for more people. And we think we've got some sound ideas to do that.
I was struck by the centrality of work in the report and basically all the proposals. The introduction of the report actually says, all of these proposals are centered on one primary goal: empower every individual to enjoy a productive life through dignified work so that they can prosper and turn their own American dream into reality. So needless to say, that contrasts pretty sharply with, let's say, the more liberal vision that argues that bigger government benefits, things now like universal basic income or expansions in welfare and other benefits, are needed because some adults can't work, or as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez famously or infamously put it, are unwilling to work. Can you talk about why work is so central to achieving the American dream?
That's a great question, Matt. And the reason that we focus on work is because we want to reemphasize the idea that the Republican Party and conservatives, we are the party of the American worker. We believe in the value of work. We believe in the dignity that it gives to individuals. We don't see work as a burden. We see it as a gift. It connects Americans to their communities. It allows you to use your talents and abilities to contribute. And we find our dignity in so many ways in what we contribute to our community. So it's a win-win-win for everybody all around. And rather than looking at it as some sort of, yoke that someone carries that's too heavy, or that there's a need, it's a kind of a victim mentality that the other side is perpetuating. And the idea of driving towards socialism or ultimately communism diminishes the value of individuals and the value of their individual contribution. And we believe in exactly the opposite. And so the objective for all of our policy, we believe, in this area, in this arena, is two things. Ultimately, we're trying to expand more the opportunity for more economic mobility for more people. And we want to do that by emphasizing and innovating the talents and the gifts of the American worker. And so we're trying to empower them, to give them tools and easier pathways to climb up to that next rung on the ladder. When individuals can do that, the whole community benefits and the nation as a whole.
Yep. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of specifics. So let's say I'm a typical working class single parent with two young kids living in your congressional district. How specifically would my life improve in, let's say, the next couple of years if the proposals in this report were enacted? And then going beyond that, how would my kids' lives be improved in the longer term? Can you give us what you think are the 1, 2, 3, whatever the sort of leading proposals are that would have the biggest immediate and kind of longer term impact on people's lives?
Yeah, great question. Sorry for the sound effect in the back there. It's my phone. I can't reach it. Turn the ringer off. Staff listening, y'all come in here and turn my phone off. We have a lot of ideas in the report that would really help the average American working family in immediate ways. And we're asked this question a lot as we've rolled out the report. Yes, members of Congress do a lot of lofty policy proposals, and this is a thick manual of ideas, but tell me what it means for me. And so we boiled it down with a couple of bullet points, and I've got a couple of them in front of me. Just a few things that come right out of this report that would appeal to that, let's say a single working mother or a young couple with a young family. The Working Families Flexibility Act would give a working parent the opportunity to earn more paid time off, which increases flexibility, of course, in their work schedule. We have childcare proposals that would seek to preserve and even expand affordable childcare options instead of these kind of harmful regulations and the bias that often exists in federal law against home-based care. We have a proposal to increase upskilling opportunities. We have a lot of workers who are capable of doing much more. They're underutilized in the workforce. And so if you allow upskilling opportunities through employers and through these programs that would incentivize that, then you allow more workers to really achieve their full potential. We really do a lot of focus on career and technical education. You'll see a common theme throughout the report is that we've got to change this kind of bachelor's or bust mentality that sort of covers the American economy right now. We recognize the reality that not everyone probably should pursue a four-year college degree. They may not need it. And we often talk about Chairman Andy Barr, who's the chairman of this task force, and I often talk about our experience with our technical and career colleges in our districts. His and mine have similar success with, for example, these welding programs, and these smaller technical and career schools can turn on a dime. They can create new programs and new curricula to respond to market needs. And so the example that we both have in Kentucky and in Louisiana in the last couple of years is that our career and technical colleges have seen a need for welders, right? So they create this program, they populate it, there's a waiting list. We're graduating welders from our communities that are going out making six-figure incomes right out of school with their two-year degree or their certification. And so it's an example of programs and policies. If we just change and kind of look at education again, if we look at the pathways to career success, we can do a lot. Many parents are struggling to obtain good education for their children. And so we talk a lot about school choice options. And one bright silver lining, if there is any, in the coronavirus pandemic is that it has highlighted both the need for and really the potential success of innovative education models. And so we've seen a lot of people experimenting in some ways with homeschooling options and with different school mechanisms and models. And so we ought to double down on that. We ought not to kind of go back and resort to the old, conventional ways. We ought to take this opportunity and build upon it. And so we talked about the ability and the way to do that. And hopefully that'll bear some good fruit.
That segues perfectly into my next question, which is actually about the coronavirus crisis. So you talked in your opening about how the task force was initiated in 2019. And at that point, the economy was rolling along with a 3-point-something% unemployment rate. And actually pulling back the veil a little bit, I understand that this report was due to be released basically as the coronavirus was kind of ramping up and forcing lockdowns and shutdowns on the country. So given all that background, how has the coronavirus and sort of what we have seen the effect of that be on low income and middle income families and all income families, how has it changed or kind of amplified some of the policy proposals that you were originally setting out to release? And what is it suggested to you that is important going forward, especially with the coronavirus as sort of the current background?
Yeah, it's a great question. We had been working on this for 15 months or so before the pandemic struck us, and we paused it, and we recognized that there were some things that we needed to go in and fine tune, not to change the model of what we had originally worked on and proposed. And by the way, the task force put countless hours in on this. We had many meetings. I'm sure some of the participants on the call were part of our kind of roundtable discussions where we brought in industry experts and innovative thinkers and think tanks and stakeholders to talk about their ideas and kind of assemble all this, because this is a big universe of policy. We try to condense it to what we thought were roughly the 100 best ideas. But we went through it again with a fine-tooth comb after the coronavirus, a few months into the pandemic, to see how we might need to make some of these changes even more immediate, because we know the reality of the economy has changed in many ways. And as we look to restore and rebuild what we had, as the president says, to make America great again, we have to make sure that the policies allow us to do that. And so regulatory barriers that have been in the way of some of these changes, have the need to change those have been highlighted now. The urgent need to expand more opportunity for more people quicker. So some of these are long-term visionary kind of goals, but we talking now seriously about making this an immediate agenda item, not just an aspiration for the future. It's something we have to do right now. And so some of the specific things are, we've talked about how a lot of workers have had to change and make a dramatic shift in their career or what they were doing to earn a living for their families due to no fault of their own. And so some of them are finding out that that they have new tax liabilities that they had not previously encountered. And so we've got to do what we can to ease the transition for those people and not put a big hurdle in the way regarding that. We have a lot of people, of course, as a result of the pandemic, who are now on public assistance for the first time. And we have to make sure that our policies encourage their quick return to the workforce, and where it doesn't kind of put them into a cycle of dependency. We got to have our federal and our state policies directed in such a way to incentivize work and enhance the dignity of work that we've been talking about. The unemployment benefit was part of the CARES Act, and we knew when the first bill was passed in the early spring, you had another $600 a week as a benefit. I mean, that was going to be a major problem in a lot of places. In my home state of Louisiana, prior to the CARES Act relief, the unemployment insurance benefit, the most that someone could collect on unemployment per week was $247. The federal government came in and added $600 on top of that. So we all know, I don't need to articulate to all of you, the problem that created. Ultimately, there's a big disincentive for workers to return to the workforce. And so they've increasingly been unattached from their employers, and even some of them, their career trajectory. And so we have to do everything we can without growing government. We have to reduce government and try to encourage people to get back into it, because that's going to be good for individuals and for the economy as a whole.
And that actually, the expanded unemployment benefit is one of the possible agenda items for the House to consider this week, right? So on Monday, Speaker Pelosi and Democrat leaders introduced it's called a Heroes 2 Act, the sort of redone version of the $3.4 trillion Heroes Act that was passed mostly on partisan basis in May. That bill would revive the $600 bonuses. It would actually add $125 on top for some individuals, some self-employed individuals, and it would extend the weeks of benefits, the weeks that benefits could be paid by, another 13 to ultimately up to 72 weeks, depending on the individual and the state they're in and all that. So even though some of these things are billed as sort of slimmed down proposals, they're actually expansions of this dynamic that says, well, we want benefits to, in reality, be larger than paychecks were before, which has these perverse incentives.
It does, and it makes people into rational economic actors. They decide to stay home and sit on the couch instead because they can make more money doing that. When we first passed the CARES Act, I started doing public service announcements in my district, and we're encouraging other members, RSC members and other members of Congress, to do the same, to inform people you actually don't get to make this choice. Okay, it's a violation of federal and state law if you're invited to come back to work and you have no coronavirus ailment or a limitation on your returning. You just decide to sit at home because you're going to make more money. That's a federal offense. I mean, this is a serious violation of law. It's also terribly immoral to do in the middle of a pandemic with limited resources. But I think that a lot of people did that just based out of ignorance and not so much out of a criminal intent. They actually thought that might make more sense for them. They didn't realize it was a violation of the law. So we have to work on that. The Pelosi bill, we had a meeting this morning. I see Chairman Barr has just joined us. I'm glad he's here. And the reason he's late, you guys, is because he does triple duty on the Hill. He also was an instrumental part of the China task force that the conference as a whole did, and they just released that report. So he's in high demand on the Hill. I'm glad he's with us. But Andy, I was just finishing up an answer here about Pelosi's latest coronavirus bill, this nonsense. And Kevin McCarthy and the Republican conference met an hour ago, and Kevin was summarizing the latest bill because none of us have read it yet. It's much of the same. He said it's just like the last version, except it's worse in some respects. And still, shockingly, the report mentions marijuana more than jobs. So that maybe tells you all you need to know. She's doing it purely for messaging, and she's pushed into a corner, being pressured We have a discharge petition, as you may have read about, on the floor, and as of this morning, I think it has over 140 signatures already. We're trying to move to the floor a bill that would give us another round of the Paycheck Protection Program, very focusing like a laser instead of this kind of shotgun approach that Pelosi wants to take, dropping cash out of helicopters. We would like to double down on the programs that we know worked and fulfilled their intended purpose. And so we're trying to discharge the bill that would refuel the PPP and allow another round of that for eligible applicants. Pelosi's resisting that because they're using it for politics, and that's where we are today. So, yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Chairman Barr, first, I just wanted to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out of a very busy and hectic week, maybe the last week that the House is in session before the election, depending on how this breaks. We've reviewed just a bunch of the basic principles, the theme of work, the kind of construction of the task force. I wonder if, as chairman of the task force, you wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what lessons you've taken from assembling these proposals. I just posed to Chairman Johnson what he thought the most powerful policies would be in the near and longer term for, say, an individual family, a mom with 2 school-age kids struggling to make it in your district. How would this make a difference in her life? And just sort of tell us about the process of being the task force chairman and coming up with the proposal.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thanks to AEI. And I'll have to credit AEI and your former CEO, Arthur Brooks, for inspiring a lot of this work, frankly, because the motto of our task force here, and I want to thank our great chairman of the RSC, Mike Johnson, for his vision to create these task force, these policy papers that provide hundreds of recommendations on how to improve the lives of so many Americans. But you know, as Arthur Brooks wrote so eloquently, we believe, like he does, that work is not a punishment, work is a blessing. And this is a task force that is built around the American dream, the idea that regardless of your personal situation, the conditions of your birth, that the outcome of your life is in your own hands, and it's in your own destiny based on the freedoms of this country. But we want to give American workers and that single mom with 2 kids that you talked about the tools that are needed to empower her and her family so that she can make a better life for herself and her kids. And so, you know, as the chairman probably told you, we broke out this task force into 3 areas. We want to talk about reimagining our educational system. We want to reform our labor policies and then reimagine welfare in a way that would empower people and encourage work and upward mobility as opposed to government dependency. But I think one of the transformational set of recommendations is in that first section on education. We have so many Americans right now who get trapped in this bachelor's or bust mentality. And one thing that every member of this task force, and I would say every member of Congress, what they are telling us is that when they go back to their districts and they go to employers and they listen to small business owners or manufacturers or agricultural businesses, whatever it is, whatever sector of the economy, there's one common theme. Yes, we need tax cuts. Yes, we need tax cuts to be permanent. Yes, we need better regulatory policies. Yes, we need better trade policies. But the one common denominator is we need workers. We need skilled workers. And the skilled trades are deficient in supplying the labor for the in-demand jobs. And this was the case when we had a roaring economy pre-COVID, where we had labor participation that was not where it needed to be. And we have it even more after COVID, when we have huge needs for labor to rebuild this economy. But one thing that all employers tell us is that we need employees with skills that can actually fill these jobs. So we have recommendations to reorient our education system to not just push kids towards a 4-year degree. We need that for American competitiveness. We need STEM educated kids. We need postgraduate educated people, but we also need cybersecurity experts. We need data security people. We need nurses. We need allied health professionals. We need welders. We need carpenters and electricians and plumbers. We need auto mechanics. And we don't have enough of those skilled people. And the great thing about it, and I'll just give one example from my district of how this can not only provide the labor that our economy needs to make America more competitive, but how it can empower individuals to make a better life for themselves, for that single mom with 2 kids. With only $15,000 for tuition in Fleming County, Kentucky, a young man or a woman can go to the Kentucky Welding Institute for 6 months and graduate with a skill in welding, and in the first year make over $100,000. And the Kentucky Welding Institute celebrates the success of those young people with no debt, because they put up on their wall of fame the helmets, the welding helmets of those individuals who graduate, are able to pay off that $15,000 and make $100,000 in their first year out of that certification. That's what this task force is about, promoting more career and technical education with no debt, to get people not just jobs that pay them, but careers that are very rewarding, and eliminate the trap of government dependency.
Right. That's the principle you're describing is actually something that's sort of a long-term principle. We've known since the early 2000s that we were looking at, in effect, labor shortages in the future. And so you had the Great Recession that masked that for a while. Now, obviously, the coronavirus collapse has sort of raised the unemployment rate. But once we get through this, we're going to be back in this situation. And we talked a little bit about the trajectory of the report when it was being drafted, mostly in 2019. The purpose of this report, in some sense, was to attract people off the sidelines of the economy, right? So you have specific provisions that go to helping people who are disabled re-enter work, or getting folks that might otherwise depend on welfare to enter work through better training or other policies.
Right, and one of my favorite recommendations in this report is to focus on second chance workers. You know, especially we've seen the opioid addiction crisis in this country get worse during the coronavirus shutdowns. I love the focus on second chance employees, formerly incarcerated people, people who don't have skills, maybe need some financial literacy and some skills-based education, but also addiction recovery and job training for folks in addiction recovery who can make great employees who are grateful for their second or third chance. And you know, this is part of their recovery, is to get skills and get back into the labor market.
Yep. So this is a report, obviously, from House conservative Republicans, but it occurred to me on looking through this, there's a whole lot of, if not potential, actual bipartisan support for many of these proposals. So, you know, you think about proposals like reforming licensing for workers, or education and training, or childcare. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that affects the prospects for proposals like this going forward, kind of regardless of what happens in November? Are these live items for 2021?
I'm confident that for many of these proposals, we can earn bipartisan support. We want bipartisan support. This is really not about Republican or Democrat. It's about empowering the American worker. And there are a few proposals in here where I've discussed with some Democrats where we've gotten some pushback, but we think they're very compelling ideas, and we want to persuade our Democrat colleagues. For example, on the issue of apprenticeships, we don't think, as the Democrat orthodoxy would suggest, that the only way you can get a good apprenticeship is to have a centrally planned Department of Labor registered apprenticeship that frankly doesn't meet the needs of the actual labor market. We think that industry and that businesses out there can design apprenticeships that actually would help train people for the jobs that these businesses actually need, and not just have a Washington directed apprenticeship programs, but allow the private sector to design apprenticeships to fill the jobs that they actually need. So we are proposing to our Democrat colleagues, don't allow the Department of Labor to have a monopoly on apprenticeships. Allow industry recognized apprenticeships to be eligible for federal assistance and federal dollars as well.
And let me just throw in real quick 4 ideas. I made a list because we've been asked about this bipartisan. Can you guys actually pass this? Is this really, are these true agenda items? And we think we can. There's four quick examples. The Pell Flexibility Act is something that a lot of Democrats agree with us. the Portable Certification for Spouses Act. That's the licensing requirements. It particularly helps persons who are in the Department of Defense. When they get moved around, their spouses can move from community to community, base to base, and be able to integrate in the workforce easier. Expansion of education savings accounts is an idea that has a lot of support on both sides of the aisle, and empowering students through Enhanced Financial Counseling Act. Because we all see, whether you're Republican or Democrat, we all see the problem. Part of this bachelor's or bust mentality problem that we all identify is that we have students who are pursuing degrees that really are not marketable. And so they graduate from college and they have a degree that in some cases is not worth the paper it's written on, because they also graduate with a mountain of debt. And so there's a lot of innovative ideas that we could do to change that problem, solve that problem. And we have Democrats who would support us on that as well.
So another question on the sort of practical nature of this. We're running a $3 trillion deficit this year. We've got $1 trillion deficits into the future as far as the eye can see. Obviously, one thing that stands in the way of any congressional proposal is it paid for? Does it add to the debt? Does it change the debt somehow? This doesn't seem to be sort of spotlighted in the report, but at various points you talk about repurposing or reprogramming funds. Can you talk a little bit about the overall idea that you have as far as these proposals relative to the federal deficit? Does it go up? Does it go down? Does it stay the same? Did that matter to you? Do you know?
Let me make a quick comment and then I'll let Andy talk, because we could both talk for an hour on this. Remember that the Republican Study Committee, our group, every member of RSC would self-identify as a fiscal hawk to some degree. We're the ones that are deeply concerned about the debt, and it's woven through as a central theme to all of our reports and everything that we produce. And the reason we come out and each year, and we came out first in this Congress with the Budget and Spending Task Force's report, is because that lays the groundwork and sets the framework for everything we produce thereafter. So this report, as all the others that preceded it, are created to be consistent with that Budget and Spending Task Force. And it is, it is a pathway to balance the budget in less than 10 years. I mean, we're talking about serious reforms because we're the guys, the men and women who lose sleep over this every night. We have a federal debt now that's 27 trillion and counting. The deficit this year, you all know what COVID has done to the numbers. We're looking at $5-6 trillion in a deficit. I'm not even sure that's an accurate calculation once you add in what the Fed's done with liquidity and everything else. And so we're the groups that sit in small groups over lunch and coffee and wring our hands over this and talk about real reforms that are absolutely critical just to save the economy and save these safety net programs that everyone relies upon. So just know that the context of the American Worker Report is complementary to and consistent with all that other work that we've done. And so while we don't have a specific chapter in this one about it, the intention here is not to grow government, not to create new programs, but rather repurpose and reorient some of that spending, and in some cases, even reduce it.
And let me just add another point. Obviously, with the American Worker Task Force, our central focus is on celebrating and promoting work. And as Arthur Brooks wrote in his book, The Conservative Heart, work gives people meaning and purpose in their lives, self-esteem. The dignity of work is what is the key to upward mobility and self-sufficiency and financial independence. And so that's really the focus. But there's a virtuous side effect to all of this. Not only do we decrease government dependency and therefore relieve some of the pressure on the taxpayer to support a sprawling welfare state, but in addition to that, we create taxpayers, we create self-sufficient workers that contribute revenue to the government. A productive, growing economy is good for deficit reduction. So on both sides of the ledger with the American Worker Task Force, we think that these proposals will not only eliminate the pressures on the public fisc and the taxpayer, because we're going to have a smaller welfare state, but we also create productive members of society who become taxpayers and so help on the revenue side. So I think the strategy for decreasing our deficit in the long run is to create capitalists, to create entrepreneurs, to create workers, as opposed to a society dependent on the government.
Chairman Barr, before you joined us, I said we were taking some audience questions. So I want to throw out an audience question. And it goes like this. A lot of American workers are impacted by trade. What proposals would work to address those who are specifically displaced by globalization? Are there specific things in the report that affect that? Is it part of the whole? Can you talk about that for a second? Either of you.
Well,
Go ahead, Andy.
okay, sure. So, I mean, I just came from the China task force, and while that's not specifically part of this, we recommended the China task force, and we've learned from the global pandemic that we need to decrease our over reliance on China with respect to our supply chains. That means we need to rebuild our domestic manufacturing base. In order to do that, we need skilled workers, and in order to address some of the trade imbalances that we have, we need to rebuild the domestic supply chains and manufacturing. That means we need better apprenticeships, IRAPs, industry recognized apprenticeships. We need short-term Pell, the Pell Flexibility Act, so that we are allowing people to access federal assistance, not just for four-year colleges for an English degree, but also a Pell for a certification in welding or in advanced manufacturing, for example. We think this is the right approach to address some of the trade pressures, the pressures of unfair trade practices, to rebuild our domestic manufacturing base with skills-based education.
And I would just add to that just simply that if we're able to enact an agenda like this and we marry it with our ongoing effort to reduce regulations and reduce taxes, make the tax cuts permanent and all the rest that we're doing, then a lot of those problems take care of themselves, because we will, as Andy's saying, we'll make the American economy more productive, more competitive. We will bring manufacturing back as we've begun to do, and we were doing before the pandemic, of course. We'll double down on those policies that worked. I mean, everybody remember, and y'all all know that if you look at the jobs report in February of 2020, it seems like it was a decade ago now, but we truly did have the greatest economy in the history of the country, arguably the history of the whole world, right? And it's not rocket science that's got us there. It was the actual implementation. It was having a bull in the china shop in the Oval Office, and a Congress that had the guts to actually advance the policies that we've all talked about our whole adult lives. And those policies work. Our economic policies work. And the policies that we're advancing now and advocating in this task force as the others is this focus is specifically on the workers themselves. And if we expand their opportunity and expand liberty for them, that's what makes America great. That's what makes our economy the greatest and strongest in the world. And we want to double down on that.
And Matt, to respond to the question, there's two quick proposals I'll bring to your attention. So to the extent globalization and trade has contributed to displacing certain workers, we recommend that we need to reimagine and modernize work. There's a lot of new types of workers, and we're proposing the new Gig Act. Congressman Tom Rice from South Carolina has recommended that we put away the old idea of employee versus independent contractor and allow gig workers to receive benefits like an employee, but remain independent contractors and direct their own work. Another good recommendation to help people adapt to globalization is a proposal called the Worker Upskilling Opportunities Through Tax Deductibility proposal. This would allow employers to deduct the cost of investing in their people to upskill them, just in the same way that they would deduct or expense investments in capital equipment. We think that makes a whole lot of sense and would allow employers to help workers adapt to a changing economy and a changing labor market.
Well, gentlemen, we're approaching 11:15. I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything in the report or around the report or in the process of coming up with the proposals in the report that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk a little bit more about or amplify?
Well, there's 95 other proposals in there, Matt. You want to go all afternoon? No, there's really some great stuff. And I'll say that, as I mentioned at the outset, that this is such a large universe of potential repairs and ideas and solutions. I mean, when Andy Barr agreed to take the ball on this, we knew he was the perfect guy to do it because he spent so much time thinking about these issues. He's very passionate about it. And we populated this task force with other members in Congress who have that same zeal. And And the reason I think this report was so widely anticipated, it really has been, is because people know this strikes, I don't know, I think it was Thoreau who said there's 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, the one who's striking at the root. And what we're doing with this is going right to the root of some of the problems that have hindered and held back the economy and hindered and held back the American worker. And so by focusing the attention, having the dialogue about it, that's why this is so valuable, what y'all are doing today. We're trying to spark these conversations to get more people conversant about this, because it brings more attention to this. It's not the most exciting stuff, right? I mean, there's bigger controversies and greater things for people to fight about and talk about. But these are the things that are going to change America's lives, and we think really set us on course for a better trajectory for the country. So that's why I put so much attention to it, and we're really glad that y'all doing it as well.
Thank you. Chairman Barr, I'll give you the last word.
Well, the last word would be just Chairman Johnson inspired me to mention one recommendation in our welfare reform section that really speaks to what this is all about. We want to get at the root issue. So many of our welfare policies that are in place today try to deal with the symptoms of homelessness or unemployment, as opposed to actually meeting people where they are and really caring for people and recognizing that everybody has worth and they have an ability to contribute to society through work. And so, for example, when we talk about reforming federal housing programs, we don't want to just warehouse people in public housing. What we propose is to abandon the failed housing first policy and instead allow housing assistance to be tied to wraparound services, financial literacy, addiction recovery services, job skills and training and career and technical education, so that we're actually addressing the underlying cause of their difficulties. This, we think, is a more humane approach to dealing with poverty, is to give people the skills and the self-esteem to escape poverty through work. That should be the focus of our reforms. That is the focus of the American Worker Task Force. And I am so proud of my colleagues for bringing forward so many good proposals like that one, replacing housing first with proposals that actually help people escape poverty, as opposed to just warehousing people in public housing.
And you don't have to go any further than the Franklin County Women's Shelter in your district to see that dynamic actually at play. Robert Dorr, the current president of AEI, visited there last year, and the management of the shelter was actually concerned that they were not going to be able to help people. They were not going to be able to have sort of a reciprocal nature of the benefits that they were offering housing in exchange for people doing something for that benefit, because of housing first as a policy sort of tying their hands. And this wasn't a bunch of wild-eyed conservatives. They described themselves literally as mostly liberals that really objected to how the federal government was preventing them from providing the best type of service they could to people in need.
Exactly.
So, well, exactly. with that, many thanks to both of you. Good luck with the rest of your week and your fall. You're doing important work, and we hope to speak with you again soon. Congratulations again on a tremendous report.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Chairman.
You got it.
All right. And with that, I believe I'm handing the baton off technologically to Scott Winship. Scott, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt, for such a really interesting conversation. And thanks to Chairman Johnson and Congressman Barr. Really fascinating discussion. So just want to say a few words first. I'm, as Matt had said earlier, the new Director of Poverty Studies at AEI. I'm in week 3, so very excited to be here. Previously, as someone who was on the Hill leading a similarly unusual project within the Joint Economic Committee, the Social Capital Project launched by Senator Mike Lee, I just wanted to commend the work of the task force. The report's consistently thought-provoking. It draws a variety of clear contrasts that highlight the difference between the vision of policymakers on the right and left today. We'll have a range of views in this panel on the specifics of the report, I think, as one would expect, given it's got over 100 proposals. But it's really an impressive document that I'd recommend to anyone looking for creative policy thinking. Just quickly, too, wanted to reiterate for people that came in late, there may be time for questions at the end. You can submit those on Twitter by using the hashtag AEI Empower Workers, or you can email them to jillian.wheeler@aei.org. It's JILLIAN.WHEELER at aei.org, and we'll have time for some at the end. All right, so very quickly, want to give proper bios to the great folks within AEI. We've got a panel of several of us that are all here. In alphabetical order, I'll start with Brent Orell. Brent is a resident fellow at AEI, where he works on job training, workforce development, criminal justice reform. Before joining AEI, Brent worked in the executive and legislative branches of the government for over 20 years. He was nominated by President George W. Bush to lead the Employment and Training Administration of the U.S. Department of Labor, and he served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Administration for Children and Families at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Brent was also acting Deputy Director in President Bush's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, served on staff in both the House and Senate before joining the administration. We also have Angela Rashidi. Angela is the Rowe Scholar in Poverty Studies at AEI, where she studies poverty and the effects of federal safety net programs on low-income Americans. She's an expert on programs including temporary assistance for needy families, child care and development block grant, supplemental nutrition assistance program, and others. Before joining AEI, Angela spent almost a decade researching benefit programs for low-income populations in New York City. Between 2007 and 2015, she served as a deputy commissioner in New York City's Department of Social Services, where she oversaw the agency's policy, research, and program evaluation efforts. She also evaluated the effectiveness of government programs as a senior researcher for Mathematica, while temporarily away from AEI, and then returned to us, which we're grateful for. Ryan Streeter is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at AEI, where he oversees research in broad portfolio, education, technology, housing, poverty studies, workforce development, public opinion. Before joining AEI, he was Executive Director of the Center for Politics and Governance at the University of Texas at Austin. He's had a distinguished career in government service, including being Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy for Indiana Governor Mike Pence, Special Assistant for Domestic Policy to President George W. Bush at the White House, and Policy Advisor to Indianapolis Mayor Stephen Goldsmith. Outside of government, he served as a Senior Fellow at the Legatum Institute and as a Research Fellow at the Hudson Institute. And then finally, Matt Weidinger, who you've been listening to. Matt's the Rowe Fellow in Poverty Studies at AEI, where his work is focused on safety net policies, including cash welfare, child welfare, disability benefits, and unemployment insurance. Before joining AEI, Matt was on the Hill as the Deputy Staff Director of the House Committee on Ways and Means, and as the longtime Staff Director of its Subcommittee on Human Resources. Matt was one of the key staff involved in the passage of welfare reform in 1996. We've got some great folks with great expertise on the panel, and we will dive right into to questions. Okay, so the task force report focuses on education, labor policy, and safety net reforms. Before we get into any specific policies, just kind of want to poll everybody on what the strengths and shortcomings of that sort of emphasis is, if the aim is to reclaim the American dream. And Matt, maybe we can start with you. Spent many years on the Hill working on some of the most important domestic policy legislation over the past 3 decades. What do you make of an effort like this versus, for instance, the Better Way agenda that was spearheaded by Paul Ryan when he was Speaker a few years ago, which had a report on poverty, mobility, and opportunity? How would you kind of compare and contrast this effort?
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for the question, Scott. So there's a lot of similarities. It's actually an interesting opportunity to review the current RSC report against the Better Way agenda that was assembled by Speaker Ryan and basically committee leaders back in 2016. The goal is to, of course, crystallize sort of House Republican in each case thinking when it comes to anti-poverty policies and work in general. The thing that jumped out to me as the most noteworthy difference is sort of a question of sequencing. The RSC report is focused on workers, and it goes through education, labor policy, and then gets to welfare. The Speaker Ryan proposal in 2016, which was formerly the Poverty, Opportunity, and Upward Mobility Task Force report, or blueprint, had that inverted. It was really sort of welfare first. The first thing that the report covered was welfare programs, the amount of spending on welfare programs, and all that. So, thematically, the focus now on assisting people who are already working, as opposed to those who are less likely to be working, or in many cases not working, and recipients of welfare, is sort of an important distinction. As I mentioned in the discussion with the members, this sort of goes unsaid for something from the RSC, but their report really doesn't get into spending. Literally, the first chart in the Speaker Ryan proposal in 2016 was the amount of money that is spent on means-tested benefit programs. And then the second chart was the 80-something benefit programs and all that. So the focus, again, was sort of much more kind of welfare specific, as opposed to people who are already working, how can we help them move up the ladder, that sort of thing. And then the final sort of general point that I would say about this is the existence of the RSC report, which touches on many of the same policy proposals and addresses many of the same issues that the 2016 report, its very existence suggests, well, these reports come, but they don't necessarily get acted on. So the 2016 report was released by Speaker Ryan. It represented the views of House Republicans who were then in the majority. They were going to remain in the majority for a couple of years. And really very little of what was in that report was ultimately enacted into law, including while we had a Republican president. So, the existence of the report does not suggest its enactment. And sometimes reports like this recur, or these themes recur, because previously we've talked about this and haven't gotten these things done. So that's my sort of general takeaway between the two.
Great. Anyone else? Education, labor, welfare, those feel like useful buckets for thinking about the American dream?
Yeah, well, I would just say too that you mentioned, since education came out of your mouth first, I thought I would just kind of jump on that one. The education section has quite a few good ideas in the higher education reform area. There's been quite a bit of progress among more conservative, reform-minded people in this space. It's not a huge room of people, but some good ideas have been out there on different ways to get the higher education kind of finance system under control and provide some alternatives. I can come back to that. But I think what was noticeable was that on the K-12 front, it was pretty thin. And I think that's not surprising. I think over the last 15 years or so, among conservatives and among Republicans, there's been kind of a reaction against the No Child Left Behind experiment, which started under George W. Bush and was focused very much on standards. And so there's been kind of a reaction against the heavy-handed federal role in that regard. And then also the whole Common Core experience too, to try to kind of nationalize curriculum standards, generated quite a bit of blowback, not just among conservatives, but also among liberals. And so I think the result is that there's a little bit of a vacuum there, and there's probably an opportunity to fill that vacuum with some things that conservatives and Republicans could embrace. So I think, for instance, the role of the federal government is obviously limited, but it does predate even the creation of the Department of Education. I mean, there have been attempts for the federal government to have some meaningful role on the schooling of children. And I think in kind of three areas, there are opportunities for kind of a reform-minded approach. One is just to take seriously the federal government's role to provide better data. And that's improved since No Child Left Behind, for all of its flaws. We have better data on outcomes for children and able to disaggregate it. So we understand by income, by race, by geography, how children are doing. And that's a primary role of the federal government. And then secondly, we could be doing a lot more just on basic and secondary research in education to understand what kinds of innovations work, what kind of new learning models matter. That's an under supported area of research, and that's something that could be done. But lastly, and I think quite importantly, there are, and my colleague at AEI, Rick Hess, has written about this eloquently many times. Conservatives know how to support choice, and they mention education savings accounts as kind of a successor to vouchers. But the environment within which choice can actually succeed is something that needs a lot of work. And what do I mean by that? I mean that very complicated set of teacher credentialing requirements. And again, this is sort of gets at union busting, right? You have all of these requirements that are created at the state level, primarily, with the union's very strong hand in this, to create all kinds of complicated tenure requirements, pay requirements, curriculum, and so on. And then federal everything from Title I to special education funding adds to those restrictions and limitations. And so really what needs to be done is to tie reform incentives to some of this federal funding so that you create an environment where flexibility and experimentation is more likely, where it's rewarded. And I think that's kind of the next phase of sort of education reform that I think is important for people that care about improving the sort of competitive dynamic at the local level. And without that, I think just block granting more money to states will just block grant it into the system that is already complicated and kind of impervious to reform ideas. So I think, it's not just enough to say we're going to support localities by block granting, because you're basically just putting block grant funding in the hands of those people who have created all of these problems that make reform really hard. And so anytime you start talking about reforming restrictions, people's eyes glaze over. It sounds kind of like a boring endeavor. But where you see competition really creating different alternatives and learning, it's because people have taken that on at one level or another. And the introduction just of charter schools themselves have forced that in a number of locales, and you can see the effects of that. So I think this is time. It's time for the next phase, and that they could have spent some time focusing on that, I think.
Yeah, the attention to choice and competition comes through in a lot of places in the report, but you're right, it's not emphasized as much in the K through 12 section. The report does advocate converting Head Start to a voucher program, which I think is really interesting and follows the similar kind of themes. Angela, related to kind of early childhood K through 12, it's in a different section of the report, but there's a little bit on childcare. What were your impressions of the childcare proposals in the report?
Yeah, sure. And even before I get to the childcare, just kind of building off of what Matt was saying, just about the three areas, obviously I think are right on. We want to look at those three areas. And I really liked the order that they did put it in, and didn't focus so much on kind of the negative aspects of welfare and what all of that drives, and really took that in that direction. And just real quickly before childcare, the other thing that struck me, and I did really like the tone that was set with this report, and I really liked the fact that the committee acknowledged the progress that has been made, but really pointed out that progress in reducing poverty specifically has been this idea of transferring money to people so they're materially better off, but has not led to increased opportunity. And I thought they were really right on with that diagnosis, and really set the tone for the rest of the report. And that really lends itself into some of the policy proposals like childcare, and really sets that stage, because childcare in particular is so critical to that idea of opportunity, because that is what allows parents to work and to earn income that is going to make themselves and their families better off. And so I really did like that focus. And I also was very happy with their discussion of childcare. I thought they diagnosed the problem again very well. So in the childcare space and really early education, we are, and I think it was Representative Johnson that mentioned this, we are becoming a federal system that's very focused on a limited choice for parents and a kind of government focused center-based care model. And this report and some of the proposals they had around childcare really kind of refocused it on giving flexibility to parents, recognizing they might need assistance, but how important those home-based providers can be for children. And again, just setting the right tone that these policies are necessary if we want to support working families and get them on that path towards opportunity.
Brent, so most of the education section, and we'll try to move on, want to make sure I cover the rest of the report as well, but most of it's focused on higher ed. And there's definitely this recurring sense that the report conveys that we're sending too many people to four-year colleges, where a lot of them would actually be better off if they had earned a different kind of credential than a bachelor's degree. There's a fair amount of talk in the report around career and technical education. what are your thoughts on the kind of balance between CTE and college? Does the report get that balance right? What are your general impressions?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I mean, I think just to start off with, the things that I really appreciated about this report, I really appreciated the way that they connected work and human dignity. Extremely important idea that we need to keep at the center of all of our policies. Like, this is about helping people fulfill their potential and to contribute meaningfully to their community and their families, to the society broadly. That's really, a very important message that I'm glad isn't getting lost in kind of the conservative world of policy development. I also really appreciated the way that they emphasize the need for diversity of approaches to career development, preparation, education. One size does not fit all. We do need a variety of approaches because people, going back to the human dignity, the centrality of human dignity is that people have different gifts and abilities that need to find a way, and they need to find a way to express those, to develop their gifts and talents. So I also thought that was really useful idea. I also, finally, on the sort of the plus side of this, I think that the emphasis in the report on strategies for making or for improving the connection between how we educate and train and the needs of employers is extremely important. And I'm going to use that then to bridge into what I think one of the main problems in the report is. I think this has taken on the characteristic of a kind of a meme among conservatives that bachelor's degrees are a waste of time, that English degrees and philosophy degrees don't matter. They're, if you can't connect the degree directly to the workforce, then it's really not worth doing. And that is not actually what employers are saying. And if we're really concerned about preparing people for the jobs of the future, we need to listen to what employers are saying about the main deficits in the workforce. If you ask, and employers are asked repeatedly, they're surveyed on this regularly, what's really missing in the American workforce, they will give you a list of 10 things, and 8 of those things have nothing to do with technical skills. They are other attributes of human development around communication, teamwork, perseverance. It's in the economists refer to this as non-cognitive skills. Workforce development professionals call it soft skills. Educators call it social emotional skills. This is what employers are telling us are mainly missing in the workforce. We take the stuff for granted. This is the baseline that we assume that people have when they go off to get their degrees and get their credentials and move into the workforce. That is a faulty assumption, particularly for the populations that we're most concerned about. People transitioning from welfare, but people in low-income communities, people coming out of single-parent families. Oftentimes, these skills are missing. If we just layer on technical skills training on top of a very weak foundation in these non-cognitive soft skills, social emotional skills, we're really doing them a disservice rather than providing them with a benefit. And so I think that's really the gap here. This connects back to the BA question, because in many ways, some of the most important things that we learn in a bachelor's program are exactly the kinds of skills that employers are saying are missing. the ability to think critically, the ability to, we've all had this experience as undergrads to go in and, you're finally forced to work in a team of people on a project and you get to see everybody's strengths and weaknesses and learn how to leverage those. We don't think of the skill side of that. We only think of the content side of it, but we need to think of the skill side of it that underlies, is implicit within the way we do bachelor's education. And I will just finally say, the data is very, very clear on this. Bachelor's degrees provide a wonderful return on investment. That's not always the case, and frequently is not the case when it comes to narrow training and narrow technical skills. And I know I said finally once, but I'm going to say finally again, which is that the workforce of the future is going to have to be able to pivot quickly to adapt to technological change. The more we emphasize the acquisition of narrow technical skills, the harder it is for the people who have those credentials to pivot to what's new, which is really a question of how quickly can you learn. And that goes back to these foundational skills that really form the basis of all learning. So that's kind of my take on the report.
So you mentioned, go ahead, Ryan.
I was just going to say, if I could just add on to what Brent said, because I wanted to just highlight that. I think those are really important comments and really important remarks, as we have a tendency to overcorrect from a season of neglect on vocational training and workforce development to kind of overcorrect to this kind of hyper focus on skills. And what Brent's talking about is really borne out in the data, and it's really, really evident. It's important. And I think it has a lot of implications for how we think about that sub-baccalaureate post-secondary kind of education environment, and creating the kinds of incentives, or at least the flexibility within the federal funding that we have, for funding to be used more adaptively to the kinds of programs where these sorts of things like Brent is talking about are possible. Because I think, Brent can correct me if I'm wrong, he's the expert here, but I think when you go find on the ground, you go to communities, all of us have probably visited them, technical and vocational training at maybe in partnerships with community colleges or at them. If there's a component that helps with critical thinking, it helps with problem solving, it helps with leadership development and teams, it's not because of any incentives in policy. It's purely the result of the entrepreneurship at the local level, usually because the training is being provided in partnership with employers who are demanding this. So we know that there's this degree inflation problem where more and more employers are requiring bachelor's degrees for jobs that actually don't require them. And it's very easy for and customary for all of us to beat up on employers. But what they're basically trying to say is at least that degree suggests that the student has gone through 4 years or so of a kind of training ground in addition to the skills that she or he have learned. And just one final point on that, when you go to the high school level and they talk about career and technical education in the report, what my colleague Nat Malkus at AEI has found in a report on CTE programs last year, which I think is one of the best studies of CTE that's been done in recent years. And he found, looking back over the decades, that concentrators at the high school level in CTE have been going to college actually at higher rates than we thought. And when you go down and you kind of disaggregate what's going on, you see that these concentrators are less in trades and in manufacturing related types of CTE tracks and more in IT and other things that, they already have kind of the ambition to go to college. They're concentrating in CTE because it supplements where they want to go. And meanwhile, the students who aren't college bound really don't have that great of outcomes because again, it's not just about getting relevant skills in an area. It's also being able to think through the regional economy in which you live, and even knowing how to pursue that opportunity, which some kids grow up in places where they get that and some don't. So I think that Brent's right. That's a big missing element in our approach to these things, which I think conservatives would do really well to think more about.
Yeah. So the middle section of the paper's on labor. I want to skip over that for now, and maybe we'll have time to come back, but we've got such expertise in Matt and Angela on the welfare policy stuff that I want to make sure we get to that. Angela, the report is very big on incentivizing more work, justifiably. I think it's probably a sentiment we all share. What do you think are the sort of most effective proposals that are in there to try to get more people back to work and self-sufficient.
Sure, you're right. I mean, the bulk of the section on welfare, and I don't love that term, but kind of on the means-tested programs for low-income families, was really focused on work. And it was largely focused on kind of work requirements and reducing fraud, and how do we tighten up these requirements that currently are on the books to make them either more effective or just to encourage people into the labor market. And I think all of those are very good provisions, things that Matt and I both have written about, Robert Doerr's written a lot about. So I think they're right on target in terms of how you can use those policies to encourage people into the labor market. I would just add, and this is kind of like pulling the conversation Ryan and Brent just had into the means-tested program space. I mean, we learned very early on in New York City's welfare programs, cash assistance programs, that trying to put people directly into hard skills training was not going to be an effective way to get them on a path towards opportunity, because they largely lacked the soft skills that employers were looking for. And employers were reluctant to hire people that came from our agency because they did lack those soft skills. The nice thing about TANF is that it does have flexibility built into it, because it's a block grant, that we could quickly change our programs and focus more on, and within the parameters of the law and the hours required and all of that, but we could quickly change the program and say, no, we need to provide more job preparation training versus any sort of hard skill training, and certainly not put people on a path towards a 4-year college degree when they were not at all prepared to get on that path. And so I think from the perspective of the report, it was very strong on the work requirements and the need to get people into work. Maybe where it could have added a little bit more was, how do we then create a public system to help people if they're facing those work requirements? How do we help them get into the labor force and give them those soft skills that they do need to be successful? And I think there could have been a little bit more on that.
So a little more connection between some of the work sections and maybe even the apprentice sections.
Exactly. And how you can pull in other policies. I mean, there are employment and training programs in SNAP. It exists in housing programs. It's just they're not robust. They're not mandated. They're not well resourced. And how do we combine the work requirements and work expectations that we do appropriately put on people with some of those supports?
Matt, I want to get your take too on the last section of the paper. I was surprised to see, pleasantly surprised, that they had revived an idea that Paul Ryan had, I think, as budget committee chair, which he called opportunity grants. The idea being to consolidate a bunch of programs together, means-tested programs, send them to the states with a lot more flexibility, and sort of let a thousand flowers bloom. Wondered if you had thoughts on that or any of the other proposals in that section.
Yeah, so the final section, it does focus on the sort of strengthening work requirements in TANF, in food stamps or SNAP, housing benefits. And those are sort of long-running conservative Republican themes. They date back to the '96 welfare reform law and well before that to Ronald Reagan and God knows how far back. So that's been a somewhat consistent theme. There's question, I think anytime policymakers look at this whole package of stuff, they encounter the tension between giving states flexibility and funding and sort of a general target and letting them then sort of figure out how to get there. The TANF program was pretty heavily prescriptive. It was prescriptive on sort of the progress that people make. So it holds states accountable for individuals being in programs, being in activities. Some of what this report proposes, because it stresses the TANF reforms that the Ways and Means Committee pulled together and actually passed through committee a couple of years ago, moves beyond the sort of progress work requirements more towards outcomes. What are the actual effect of these programs? Do they actually result in more people than otherwise being in work? Do they result in people earning more and all that? And I think to the degree that sort of outcome focus can be leveraged as part of this, that's a healthy dynamic. The other thing I would say is sort of the contrast between where Republicans, as represented in this report, are and where Democrats are and seem to be going is increasingly stark. So for a long time, the idea of work work supports, having welfare benefits support people in their progress to go into work, and moving up the ladder was something that was really kind of a bipartisan issue. More than half of Democrats in Congress in 1996 supported the work-based welfare reform law. But that's become increasingly polarized. I mean, you see the sort of highlighting of proposals like universal basic income, child allowances. Sort of the drift on the left seems to be increasingly in the direction of giving people money because of who they are, but unassociated with their participating in work activity or training or something like that. And that's, I think, somewhat troubling for both the future of policy, but also I think the prospects of something like this proposal actually getting enacted, because it's facing an increasingly uphill climb in terms of getting Democrat buy-in to a lot of these sort of work-based proposals.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think even in some of the other areas in the report, the drift, I think, on the center left is towards more free stuff on education. It's sort of free college and forgiving student loan debt. And one of the things I really liked about the report is that it did really contrast the different visions that the different sides have. One more on the welfare policy section. So there's some important rhetorical nods to the importance of family formation and marriage. Interesting when you sort of dig into the report, there's not a ton there in the way of policies to try to reverse the decline in marriage that we've seen, and that could just be because we don't know how to do that. But Matt or Angela, thoughts on whether there are ways that federal policy might be able to move the needle on that?
Angela, you want to take the first crack?
Well, yeah, just real quickly, and I know we've all had these discussions a lot of times, right? Right, Scott? But I don't think the federal government is in a good position to directly try to influence marriage and increase marriage. I mean, we've had more than a decade of marriage promotion programs, which are marginally effective, but haven't had very large impacts. But what I do think, and I think that the report kind of gives a little bit of strength to this argument, it is that that government programs can create the environment that creates an environment that supports marriage. And I think that's where there can be a little bit of work done, like reducing marriage penalties, which the report didn't specifically address how you would do that, but there certainly are proposals out there where we can reduce marriage penalties in some of these policies. And I think that is likely a better direction to go than to try to think that we can somehow directly affect marriage rates through public policy.
It's also worth pointing out that on the left, the argument that marriage has declined often gets connected with sort of the downskilling of guys' inability to get decent jobs and all that. So if the broader pursuit that the report reflects is successful and more men and women become more skilled, more able to take the jobs of the future and all that, then presumably that would have an effect in terms of marriage as well, if the critique on the left is accurate to start with.
Yep. Last question for everybody. I think, Matt, you sort of addressed this to the chairman and Congressman Barr. Any shot that any of this gets passed, you think, beyond 2020? What's most likely to meet with support, bipartisan or otherwise? What's not? Anyone feel free to jump in. Matt, you want to go ahead first?
Yeah, I think, as my comments about the sort of the comparison between this and the Paul Ryan Better Way blueprint suggest, a lot of these are they're not quite perennial proposals, but they're frequent proposals that are difficult to enact or have been difficult to enact. So some of this obviously will depend on what happens in the fall and who's in charge of the majority in the House and the Senate next year, and the administration, obviously. The bigger picture suggests, as I mentioned before, that parties are disagreeing on more sort of fundamental provisions that undergird a lot of this stuff. So that doesn't really give me a lot of confidence that there's going to be a coming together around more promotion of work and the goals of this, which, it doesn't mean that Republicans shouldn't be proposing these policies, but I think sort of people on the outside looking at this have to have sort of an objective view of what are the practical realities of that. That said, some of these things do have sort of a bipartisan pedigree. I'm thinking about licensing reforms that, some states are implementing, and My sense is some of the labor policy is potentially doable, but there are challenges here.
So I guess I would say that I think that the specifics of any given proposal, it's sort of dicey. The sausage making process, you can hardly recognize it sometimes when it comes out on the other end as to whether it was what was in here or over there. Things get kind of smashed together. But I do think that there is some room for common ground again, or for conservatives on this question of dignity. The importance of work to human dignity. I think that has a broad bipartisan appeal that could be pursued. I also think that the structure of the post-COVID unemployment problem may present some opportunities for advancing the idea of choice for workers, because in January, we had a 3% unemployment rate. If you were still unemployed in January, you probably had a reason for being unemployed. I mean, there's probably some significant barriers there. But now at 8, 9, wherever we are, you've got a lot of people who never thought they would ever be unemployed and are more than capable of getting themselves back into the labor market. And I think we can make an argument for that population. They don't need all these government services. What they need are resources and opportunities to help them transition back to work. And that argues for a much broader, more flexible, and more worker-directed approach. So I think that between those two things, this emphasis on the importance of work and the dignity that it provides, and the capacity of people to run their own lives, we ought to be able to build some consensus around those ideas and pursue policies that advance both.
And just real quickly, I mean, I don't think any specific proposals in the welfare section, for example, are likely to pass. But I do think that, I mean, conservatives are often criticized for proposing policies that are more around punishing people for being poor rather than trying to move them ahead. I think that the framing of this report was very helpful in kind of not doing that, but also really presenting a picture of these policies when it's big government policies, it can be harmful to poor people, and we have a different vision. We want to help people and put them on a path. I think that framing is very useful and can maybe open some doors for future bipartisan efforts. And I'm hopeful that's what maybe can come out of this report.
Yeah, and I'm impressed. There's so many policies on here that that we couldn't possibly get to all of them, but there are a lot of really innovative proposals. Things like pay for success, which we all know about, but most folks don't. It's sort of a way to get kind of third parties to administer programs to solve a specific goal, to get a specific behavioral change among a certain group of people, and then the third party doesn't get paid unless they actually can demonstrate that they've changed the outcomes that were targeted to begin with. Income share agreements is another one, I think, as an alternative to student loan debt, where investors actually finance some of the cost of higher ed, and in return they get a certain percentage of a graduate's pay for a certain amount of time. That puts more of the risk on investors rather than on the first-time college goer, for instance. We do have a question from out there in the broader world. John asks, is there a different moral vision of human dignity between right and left? Ryan, you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think more broadly, I think Brent is right that it's a value that is shared on the right and the left. And if you listen to kind of the extremes on both the right and the left, you're going to get sort of very different visions. But I think, from even our own survey work that we do at AEI, you find that people who self-declare themselves as progressives or liberals, who identify as Democrats, and those who say they're conservative and identify as Republicans, when it comes to their view of the American dream, they're actually quite similar. It has to do with being free, and it has to do with being able to fulfill your vocational desires. People share this kind of very broadly. And so I think the extremes that we talk about that really want to coddle people and minimize kind of the negative impacts of work. It's a large part of our kind of debate about policy right now. But I think there's a generally kind of strongly held view by a lot of Americans that a big part of our identity is what we do for a living, and it's more than just collecting a paycheck. It's about development. It's about making a contribution. That's what people want, and regardless of what they say politically, when you just have conversations with people, that's kind of where they go when they're talking about decisions they're making about their career. So I do think that there's probably more agreement just on the ground in communities than you would know if all you do is spend your time on social media or your Twitter feed.
Yeah, great thoughts. It's amazing sometimes to think that kind of we can all start with the very similar basic values, and then the politics takes us in very different directions. But I think if we can get more creative thinking on both the left and the right along the lines of this report, maybe there's hope in the end to help American workers, which is what everybody wants to do in the end. We are out of time, so thank you to everybody on the panel for a really stimulating conversation. Thanks to everybody out there who tuned in. Hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. This will be up on the web eventually, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you all.
Bye.